Welcome, weary travelers, to the gray mist of the soul's borderlands. Step carefully, right? Because today we're walking straight into the domain of the Pale Inquisitor, the ghost of absolute law. Consider this an explainer of the human mind when it tries, desperately, to completely eradicate its own chaotic nature. It's a dark, psychological parable about destruction, transformation, and ultimately building your own self-imposed prison.
Our source material actually kicks off with this incredibly haunting image. In the gray mist of the soul's borderlands, the Pale Inquisitor, the ghost of law, stood between two shadows that were both his own and yet entirely alien. I want you to imagine standing in a desolate mental wasteland, completely caught up in an internal war. On one side of you, there's this messy, raw draft of who you are. On the other, a rigid, suffocating tapestry. When you really dig into this, you realize we aren't just looking at a fantasy setting here. This is a confessional portrait of the human psyche at war with itself. It's literally the ultimate internal struggle playing out in the theater of the mind.
Now, to really get what's happening here, we've got to look at this through a couple of specific psychological lenses. First up is the Freudian id. We all know this one. It's our primal, chaotic, instinctual self. In our parable, this is perfectly represented by the silver wolf. Second, we have the Jungian shadow, which refers to those repressed, dark, unconscious aspects of our psyche that we just flat out refuse to acknowledge. Our story maps this to what's called the wild verdant. So the Pale Inquisitor is essentially acting as this extreme, tyrannical superego, trying desperately to manage these massive, powerful forces.
Act 1. The Hunt for a Blank Void.
So, back in the early days of this internal wasteland, the Inquisitor looked at the silver wolf, this completely wild Freudian id, and saw nothing but chaotic noise. To him, it was a deadly contagion. It wasn't something to be understood, and it certainly wasn't something to be integrated. It was a fundamental threat to his grand, pure, cosmic design. Basically, a disease that needed curing. And his cure? It was absolutely brutal. Purification through subtraction. He didn't want to just train the beast, he wanted to erase it from existence. He firmly believed that if he could just edit the soul down to a single blank page, he'd achieve this state of perfect, law-abiding nothingness. He was chasing the absolute safety of a vacuum, convinced that by completely subtracting those messy, primal instincts, he would finally be clean.
And to actually achieve this void, well, he brought out some downright terrifying tools. First, the spectral bell. Think of it like those medieval bells they'd ring to ward off demons. Here, it acts as a psychological Pavlovian trigger. It literally tolls to kill spontaneous thought, reminding the inner self of its guilt the exact second it tries to speak up. Then we have the internal scourge. Similar to the flagellants of the Middle Ages whipping themselves to stave off the Black Death, the Inquisitor used straight-up pain to stop the infection of the silver wolf. And finally, the ink of regret. He kept this ledger, but it wasn't tracking growth. No, it was tracking endless failures and betrayals, essentially ensuring the past could never, ever be escaped. Together, these tools enforced a rigidly funeralian discipline over the entire mind.
Act 2. The Dark Apotheosis.
But here's the thing. An approach based purely on punishment and erasure, it just can't last. A moment finally arrived, sparked by an artifact known as the Emerald Staff, where the Inquisitor realized a truly terrifying truth. The primal beast cannot be deleted. So, he pivots. The entire geometry of his devotion completely changes. See, when he used the scourge, he treated the beast as a hunted anomaly, which gave him a deeply repressed id. But as we know, the more you scourge and repress your instincts, the more violent they become. Following the apotheosis, the beast becomes a weaponized asset. The Inquisitor stops fighting it and actually becomes its master. The psychological result of this? That repressed id mutates into a massive, violent, fully incorporated Jungian shadow. His frantic pursuit of purity was the very fire keeping the darkness alive.
Act 3. The Creation of the Living Cage.
This dark realization triggers a profound psychological climax. The chaotic silver wolf doesn't just disappear, it evolves into its radical opposite. The Inquisitor's whole methodology flips. He goes from being a hunter trying to kill a predator to an architect designing a prison. But here's the kicker. The prison is made out of the beast itself. On one side, we had destructive erasure, that hunt for the blank vacuum, the void, where the ultimate goal was perfect purity. But now we have eternal entrapment, the overgrowth. The new goal is absolute finality within a living grave. He traded the pursuit of a blank page for a singular, completely rigid tapestry. The soul isn't being erased anymore, it is simply pinned in place, permanently paralyzed by the immense weight of its own integrated darkness.
The source text nails this description perfectly, calling the wild verdant a suffocating web of verdant iron.
Honestly, it's a grim paradox we're all probably a little too familiar with. You try so hard to rigidly control your bad habits that the control itself mutates into a monster. It is the absolute ultimate endpoint of toxic perfectionism. The silver wolf represented wild, unrefined desire. The wild verdant represents those exact same primal instincts, but now they're forced into the service of absolute law. All that chaotic energy is forcefully channeled into iron-thorned briars and spectral vines, and every bit of it is grown using that dark ink of regret. The predator has literally become the servant of the law, keeping absolutely everything trapped and motionless.
Epilogue: The Architect of the Grave.
Looking out over this mental wasteland, the Inquisitor faces an incredibly weary realization. If we trace this tragic evolution, it started with the Silver Wolf's raw ID, moved into the scourging phase, completely mutated during the apotheosis, and finally ended in entrapment. He's no longer a spectral judge presiding over a void. He's now the monastic warden of an overgrowth. And here is the true tragedy of it all. He is a martyr, draped in his own chains. He suffers just as much as those he judges. By constantly seeking a safe, motionless line, the Inquisitor evolved from a hunter into a caged predator himself. He stopped trying to kill the beast, only to realize, too late, that he had become the cage. He's totally crushed by his own sense of duty, guarding a static storm where absolutely nothing can grow, simply because he's too rigid to allow the natural flow of life.
Only the dead and the trapped cannot fail. Wow. If that doesn't perfectly capture the ultimate endpoint of toxic perfectionism, I don't know what does. The Inquisitor represents that deeply dark voice inside the human mind that falsely promises you safety through total paralysis. He traded the beauty of a complex, messy, disharmonious life for cold, untouchable safety. But in doing so, he utterly destroyed the forest they both lived in. To win the battle against his very own nature, he essentially had to stop living altogether. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a haunting question derived directly from our source analysis. If the Inquisitor is a fragmented spirit who has spent his entire lifetime tallying up failures, what exactly has he omitted from his ledger? Is there a single memory or a single desire so pure that his ink of regret just cannot touch it? And if there is, could that untainted memory be the key to collapsing the Iron Bridge and finally freeing the soul? Definitely something to think about the next time you hear that spectral bell toll in your own mind. Safe travels through the gray mist, weary travelers.